Chapter 13. The Empress's Burden. In the opulent but increasingly suffocating chambers that had once been her sanctuary within the Tuileries Palace, Josephine Bonaparte knelt before a simple wooden crucifix, feeling the weight of the world pressing down upon her shoulders. The ancient relic Brother Francois had pressed into her hands seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, warm against her palms, despite the growing chill that had settled over the palace like a shroud. The room around her had changed in subtle but disturbing ways over the past weeks. Shadows lingered in corners where no shadows should fall. Portraits of Napoleon seemed to follow her with their eyes, and sometimes, late at night when the rest of the palace slept, she could hear whispers in languages that made her skin crawl just to listen to them. Mon Dieu, she prayed in a voice barely above a whisper. I am not strong enough for this burden. I am not brave enough to face what my husband has become. The crucifix grew warmer in her hands, and for a moment she could swear she felt a presence in the room with her, not malevolent like the shadows that increasingly plagued the palace, but something peaceful, protective, filled with infinite compassion. But the moment of comfort was shattered by a soft knock at her door. Madame l'Impératrice, came a familiar voice. It is Marie Claire. I bring fresh linens. Josephine hesitated. Over the past few days, she had begun to notice things about her longtime servant that she had somehow overlooked before. The way Marie Claire moved through the palace corridors without disturbing the increasingly aggressive shadows, how she seemed to know things about the supernatural threat facing them that a simple laundress should not possess. And most unsettling of all, how the other servants had begun looking to her for guidance with a deference that bordered on reverence. Enter. Marie Claire, said Josephine finally. The woman stepped into the chamber carrying her usual bundle of crisp white sheets, but Josephine noticed immediately that her simple grey dress seemed somehow more elegant than usual, more purposeful, and her eyes, those plain brown eyes that had looked at Josephine with humble servitude for years, now held depths that spoke of wisdom far beyond her station. As Marie Claire's gaze fell upon the ancient crucifix in Josephine's hands, she stopped abruptly. For a long moment, the two women simply looked at each other across the gulf that separated Empress from servant, and in that silence, Josephine felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing against the air between them. Forgive me, madame, Marie Claire said quietly, setting down the linens with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. But I see you carry a burden far heavier than imperial jewels. Josephine's breath caught. Never in all the years of their acquaintance had her servant spoken to her with such familiarity, such apparent understanding of her inner turmoil. Marie Claire, I don't understand what you mean. You wonder if you have the courage to stand against the darkness that has taken hold of the emperor's heart, the laundress continued, her voice steady and sure, filled with a quiet authority that made the shadows in the corners seem to shrink back slightly. You fear that your faith is not strong enough to face what he has become, that your love is not pure enough to save him from the path he has chosen. Josephine rose to her feet, the crucifix still clutched in her hands, her heart pounding. How could you possibly know what troubles me? How could a servant understand? Because I have walked in darkness before, madame. Marie Claire interrupted gently, because I have stood at the crossroads between despair and hope, between vengeance and forgiveness, between the easy path of surrender and the hard road of faith. Slowly, with movements that seemed to carry the weight of ritual, Marie Claire began rolling up the sleeve of her right arm. As the fabric fell away, Josephine gasped at what was revealed. A series of small scars arranged in the perfect shape of a cross, the flesh around them bearing an almost luminous quality that seemed to generate its own soft light. When word came that my Henri had fallen at Austerlitz, Marie-Claire continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a sacred story. I thought God had abandoned me. The pain was indescribable. Not just the grief of loss, but the rage. Rage at Napoleon for starting the war, rage at Austria for fighting it, rage at God for allowing it to happen. She moved closer to Josephine, and as she did, the Empress noticed that the shadows in the room continued to retreat, as if they could not bear to come within a certain distance of the marked woman. On the night I meant to end my grief with poison, rat poison I had stolen from the palace kitchens, I was visited by someone, a figure in white who appeared in my chambers as I held the vial to my lips. Marie-Claire's eyes grew distant, remembering. He spoke to me of grief transformed into compassion, of suffering made sacred through acceptance, of darkness conquered not through anger but through love, so pure it could illuminate the deepest night. Josephine found herself drawn forward despite her confusion and fear. Who was he? This figure? Marie-Claire smiled, and in that expression, Josephine glimpsed something that took her breath away. A serenity so complete, a faith so unshakable that it seemed to transform her plain features into something almost angelic. I believe you know, madame, the same presence you feel when you hold that crucifix and pray for strength. She gestured to the relic in Josephine's hands, the same voice that whispers to you in the darkest hours that all is not lost, that even the deepest shadow can be conquered by those willing to carry the light. As if responding to her words, the crucifix in Josephine's hands began to glow with a soft, warm radiance that filled the chamber and pushed the remaining shadows back to the very walls. The mark, you see, Marie-Claire continued, indicating the scars on her arm, appeared the moment I chose faith over despair, hope over vengeance, love over hate. It burns sometimes, especially when evil draws near. But it also protects, strengthens, guides. And with it came knowledge I should not possess, understanding I did not seek, and a mission I could not refuse. She knelt beside Josephine, her simple servant's dress somehow appearing more dignified than the Empress's elaborate gown. I know of the Emperor's plans because the darkness he courts whispers its secrets to those who bear the light. I know of the shadow's origin in the Carpathian Mountains because I have seen visions of the ancient evil that dwells there, and I know that the ritual he plans for the feast of Saint Bartholomew will succeed unless those who serve the light are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. Josephine sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what she was hearing. Marie-Claire, who are you really? You speak like a saint? Marie-Claire's laugh was gentle, self-deprecating. I am who I have always been, a laundress, a widow, a woman born to poverty, who never learned to read or write properly. But sanctity, madam, is not about education or station. It is about choice. The choice to love when hatred would be easier, to hope when despair seems reasonable, to serve when self-interest calls. She reached out and gently touched the crucifix in Josephine's hands, and the moment her scarred flesh made contact with the ancient metal, the light blazed even brighter, filling the room with a radiance that seemed to cleanse the very air. That relic you hold, Brother Francois chose well when he entrusted it to you. It is not merely a symbol, but a weapon forged in the fires of perfect faith. And you, Madame, are not merely an empress caught in the web of her husband's ambitions. You are the key to his salvation, the one person in all the world who might yet reach the man he was before the shadow claimed him. Tears began flowing down Josephine's cheeks as she felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders. But I'm not strong enough. I'm not pure enough. I've made so many mistakes, committed so many sins, and that, Marie Claire said firmly, is precisely why you are perfect for this task. The greatest saints were not those who never fell, but those who fell and chose to rise again. Your love for Napoleon is real, flawed, complicated, sometimes selfish, but real. And real love, Madame, even imperfect love, is the most powerful force in creation. She stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the city of Paris, where the lights seemed dimmer than usual, as if the very illumination was being slowly drained from the world. The Emperor believes he can bind the shadow to himself and remain unchanged. He believes he can trade his humanity for power and lose nothing of value. But he is wrong. The darkness he courts will not make him immortal. It will make him empty, hollow, a vessel for hungers that can never be satisfied. Josephine joined her at the window, still clutching the glowing crucifix. In the streets below, she could see figures moving, people going about their evening routines, but something was wrong with their movements. They were too synchronized, too purposeful, as if they were all responding to some unheard signal. It's already begun, hasn't it? Josephine whispered. The transformation of Paris. The eastern quarters have fallen completely, Marie Claire confirmed. Thousands of good people, corrupted not through evil in their hearts, but through despair, through fear, through the simple human desire to belong to something greater than themselves. The shadow feeds on those emotions, transforms them, uses them as anchors to spread its influence. She turned to face Josephine directly, her eyes blazing with inner fire. But there is hope. The ritual requires willing participants, souls freely given to the darkness. Those who have been infected but not yet fully transformed can still be saved, but only if they are offered something stronger than what the shadow provides. And what is that? Love. Real, sacrificial love. The kind of love that seeks not its own benefit, but the good of the beloved, even unto death. Marie Claire's voice grew urgent. The Emperor's ritual on the feast of Saint Bartholomew will attempt to bind every soul in Paris to his will. But if even a few thousand can be cleansed of the shadow's influence before then, if they can be reminded of what it means to love truly, to hope genuinely, to believe in something worthy of belief, then the ritual will fail. Josephine felt the warmth from the crucifix spreading through her body, filling her with strength she had not felt in months. What must we do? We must gather the faithful, not just the priests and bishops, but the ordinary people who remember what it means to serve something greater than themselves. Servants and seamstresses, bakers and blacksmiths, mothers and daughters who have kept the old faith alive in their hearts despite the world's growing darkness. Marie Claire's voice rose with passion. We must become an army of light in the very heart of shadow. A distant sound reached them through the window, singing, but singing of a strange and terrible kind. The voices were human, but they moved in perfect unison, chanting words that seemed to make the glass rattle in its frames. They gather in the squares now, Marie Claire observed, her expression grim. Every night, more join their ranks. The Emperor calls to them through the shadow, promising them immortality, power, freedom from suffering. And many answer that call because they do not understand the price. Josephine pressed her face to the glass, trying to see the singers in the darkened streets below. What price? Their souls. Not in the sense the old stories tell, not a transaction with some horned demon, but something far more subtle and terrible. The shadow doesn't steal their souls. It empties them, drains away everything that makes them human. Their capacity for independent thought, for genuine emotion, for the kind of love that requires sacrifice. They become vessels, nothing more. As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at the chamber door. But this was not the gentle tap of a servant seeking admission. This was a commanding rap that seemed to carry authority. Josephine. Napoleon's voice, but somehow changed, deeper, more resonant, carrying harmonics that made the windows vibrate. I would speak with you. Marie-Claire immediately moved to stand between the Empress and the door, her scarred arm beginning to glow more brightly. Do not admit him, madame. Not while you hold the relic. The shadow that inhabits him cannot cross the threshold while you bear that light. But he is still my husband, Josephine protested weakly, even as she felt the truth of Marie-Claire's words in her bones. The man you married is still there, Marie-Claire acknowledged. But he grows weaker each day, while the thing that shares his flesh grows stronger. If you face him now, without preparation, without allies, you may not have another chance. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and with it came a sound like whispers, dozens of voices speaking in unison just below the threshold of hearing. Josephine, Napoleon called again, and now there was a note of command in his voice that had never been there before, not even at the height of his imperial power. I know you are there. I know what you carry. Come out, and let us discuss this situation, like civilized people. Marie-Claire's scars blazed brighter, and Josephine could see actual pain cross her features as the proximity of such concentrated evil took its toll. He cannot enter, but his influence grows stronger. We must leave this place, madame. Gather what you need, the relic, any other blessed objects you possess, and come with me. Where can we go? This is his palace, his city. There are places the shadow cannot reach, people it cannot touch. The faithful have been preparing, creating sanctuaries where the light burns too bright for darkness to intrude. Marie-Claire was already moving toward a tapestry that hung on the far wall. Did you know, madame, that this palace has tunnels? Passages built in older, simpler times when faith meant more than power. She pulled the tapestry aside, revealing a narrow doorway that Josephine had never noticed before. Beyond it lay a passage lit by candles that seemed to burn with the same warm light that emanated from the crucifix. How is this possible? Josephine breathed. Because those who serve the light have been busy, while those who serve the shadow made their grand plans. We have been preparing, organizing, sanctifying. The battle for Napoleon's soul and for the soul of France itself begins now. The knocking at the main door had stopped, but now they could hear something else. The sound of multiple footsteps in the corridor outside, and voices speaking in that same unnatural unison they had heard from the street singers. Choose now, madame, Marie-Claire urged, extending her hand toward the passage. Choose between the husband who was and the emperor who might yet be saved. Choose between the comfortable prison of your chambers and the dangerous freedom of faith. Josephine looked one last time around the room that had been her refuge for so many years, then at the crucifix that burned like a star in her hands, and finally at the simple servant woman who had revealed herself to be so much more. I choose hope, she said firmly, and stepped toward the hidden passage. As they disappeared into the tunnels beneath the palace, the door to her chambers finally opened. Napoleon stood in the doorway, but his shadow stretched far beyond the dimensions his physical form should have cast, writhing and reaching into the room like grasping tentacles. His eyes, when they fixed on the empty space where his wife had stood, reflected no light at all. "So be it," he whispered, and his voice was the sound of winter winds through dead trees. "The game begins in earnest now." Behind him, figures in imperial livery filled the corridor, but their faces were wrong, too pale, eyes too dark, smiles too wide. They moved with perfect synchronization, like dancers responding to music only they could hear. "Find her," Napoleon commanded, and the shadows on the walls began to move independently of their sources. "Find them all, the faithful, the pure, the stubbornly hopeful. Find them, and teach them what it means to resist the inevitable." But in the tunnels beneath the palace, walking toward a light that grew brighter with each step, Josephine and Marie Claire heard none of this. They walked in silence for a time, the only sound their footsteps echoing off ancient stone walls, carved with symbols that predated Napoleon's empire by centuries. "Where are we going?" Josephine finally asked. Marie Claire's smile was radiant in the candlelight. "To gather an army, madam, an army of souls who remember what it means to love something greater than themselves. The battle for France begins tonight." Chapter 14. The Laundress's Secret. Marie-Claire Duret had been many things in her 43 years of life. A farmer's daughter, a soldier's wife, a palace servant, a widow, but she had never imagined she would become what she was now, a living sanctuary in a world increasingly consumed by shadow. As she led the Empress through the ancient tunnels beneath Paris, the scars on her arm pulsed with their own inner light, each throb a reminder of the night her ordinary life had ended and her extraordinary purpose had begun. The passage they followed was older than the Tuileries Palace above, older than Napoleon's empire, perhaps older than Christianity itself in France. The walls were carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Celtic spirals, intertwined with early Christian crosses, Roman numerals giving way to script in languages she had never learned but somehow understood. "Marie Claire," the Empress said softly as they walked, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. "You promised to tell me the truth about who you are, about what you are." Marie Claire considered her words carefully. The truth was complex, layered, and would have sounded like madness to anyone who had not witnessed what they both had witnessed in the palace above. But Josephine deserved to know, needed to know, if she was to play her part in what was to come. "I told you I was visited the night I meant to take my own life," Marie Claire began, her voice steady despite the memories that still brought pain. "But I did not tell you what happened before that visitor came, or why I was chosen to receive such unusual grace." They reached a junction in the tunnels where several passages branched off in different directions. Without hesitation, Marie Claire chose the path that sloped downward, following a route she had never walked but knew with absolute certainty. The knowledge had come with the marks, not learned information, but understanding that existed in her bones, her blood, her very spirit. "My Henry died at Austerlitz," as I said, but what I did not say was how he died. Not in glorious battle, not leading a charge or defending a position, but slowly, horribly, over the course of 3 days, calling my name as gangrene consumed the wound in his leg. Josephine placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Marie Claire, you don't have to, but I do, madame, because what happened to Henri was not accident or mere misfortune of war. It was orchestrated a sacrifice made to darker powers than Napoleon even then realized he was serving. The passage opened into a larger chamber, circular in design, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. Around the walls, alcoves held statues, not of pagan gods or Christian saints, but figures that seemed to represent something older, more fundamental. A woman holding scales, a man bearing a torch, a child cradling a dove. Even then, 5 years ago, the shadow was whispering to him. Marie Claire continued, moving to the center of the chamber where a simple stone altar stood. Upon it lay objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. A wooden cup, a length of rope, a piece of bread. Not the overwhelming presence it is now, but subtle suggestions, dark dreams, promises of power that would come to seem more reasonable as time passed. She touched the stone surface of the altar, and immediately the chamber filled with a warm, golden radiance that made the carved symbols on the walls stand out in sharp relief. The night Henry died, I was not with him. I was here, in Paris, tending to the Empress's wardrobe, while my husband lay dying in an Austrian field hospital, calling for a wife who was too far away to hear. Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. When the news came, brought by a young sergeant whose face I will never forget, I broke something inside myself, not just my heart, but my faith, my hope, my basic trust in the goodness of existence. The Empress was watching her with growing amazement, beginning to understand that the woman she had known as a simple servant was far more complex than she had ever imagined. For weeks after, I went through the motions of life, serving in the palace, washing clothes, preparing meals, but inside, I was dying. The rage grew like a cancer, fed by questions that had no good answers. Why, Henry? Why us? Why did God allow good men to suffer while evil seemed to prosper? Marie Claire picked up the wooden cup from the altar, and as her fingers touched its rim, the light in the chamber grew brighter still. The night I decided to end my suffering with poison, I came here first. I don't remember making the conscious decision to seek out this place. I simply found myself walking through passages I had never seen before, following a path that seemed to call to me. How did you know of these tunnels? Josephine asked. I didn't. But grief, madame, can be a powerful force, not just destructive, but revelatory. It strips away the comfortable illusions that normally shield us from deeper truths. In my pain, I could suddenly perceive things that had always been there but hidden from ordinary sight. She gestured to the alcoves around them, where the statues seemed to be watching their conversation with benevolent attention. This chamber is a sanctuary, built in the early days of Christianity in Gaul by believers who understood that faith must sometimes go underground to survive. For over 1,000 years, it has served as a place of refuge for those who carry the light in dark times. Moving to one of the alcoves, Marie Claire knelt before a statue that depicted a woman in simple robes, her face serene despite the tears carved upon her cheeks. I prayed here that night, not the formal prayers I had learned as a child, but the raw, desperate plea of a soul pushed beyond all endurance. I asked for understanding, for peace, for the strength to either bear my burden or the courage to lay it down forever. The carved woman seemed to smile, though her expression had not changed, and that is when he appeared, not in blinding light or accompanied by angelic choirs, but quietly, gently, as if he had been waiting there all along for me to notice him. Who? Josephine whispered, though something in her heart already knew the answer. The same presence you feel when you hold that crucifix, Marie Claire replied. The same voice that speaks to every human soul in moments of ultimate darkness, offering hope when hope seems impossible, love when love seems pointless, Faith when faith seems naive. She stood and returned to the altar, where the simple objects continued to glow with their sacred light. He did not take away my grief. That would have dishonored Henri's memory and denied the reality of love itself. Instead, he transformed it, showed me how suffering willingly accepted could become a doorway to compassion, how personal loss could become universal understanding. Marie-Claire rolled up her sleeve again, revealing the luminous scars that formed a perfect cross on her forearm. The marks appeared as he spoke, burning like brands but somehow not causing pain. With each word he said, the scars grew brighter, and with their light came knowledge I had never sought but desperately needed. What knowledge? Josephine asked, stepping closer to examine the miraculous marks. I saw the shadow for what it truly was, not evil in the sense of personal malice, but emptiness, void, the absence of love, hope, faith, all the qualities that make existence meaningful. And I saw how that emptiness was spreading, not just through Napoleon, but through countless souls across Europe, feeding on despair and offering false promises of power in return for surrender of everything that makes us human. The chamber around them seemed to pulse with life, as if the stones themselves were breathing. In the alcoves, the statues appeared more lifelike now, their carved features animated by the sacred light that filled the space. But I also saw hope. Marie-Claire continued, her voice growing stronger. I saw that the shadow, for all its ancient power, was fundamentally parasitic. It could only exist by consuming what others created, could only spread by corrupting what was already good. And that meant it had a weakness. It could be starved, defeated, if enough people chose to feed the light instead of the darkness. She moved to different alcoves, touching each statue in turn. As her scarred hand made contact with the carved stone, each figure seemed to come alive for a moment, eyes that flickered with intelligence, lips that seemed to mouth silent blessings. These are not pagan idols or Christian saints, she explained, seeing Josephine's confusion. They are representations of virtues, justice, wisdom, innocence, courage, mercy. The early Christians who built this sanctuary understood that faith was not just about believing in God, but about embodying divine qualities in human form. And you were chosen to be such an embodiment? The Empress asked, her voice filled with awe. Marie-Claire's laugh was gentle, self-deprecating. Chosen, perhaps. Or perhaps I simply chose. Chose love over hate, hope over despair, service over self-pity. The miracle is not that I was selected for some grand purpose, but that any of us can be, at any moment, if we are willing to pay the price. What price? Everything. Marie-Claire replied simply. Everything that the world tells us matters. Comfort, security, the approval of others, even our own lives, if necessary. The light demands total commitment, absolute surrender to something greater than ourselves. She picked up the length of rope from the altar, and as she held it, Josephine could see that it was not ordinary rope, but something finer, almost silk-like, that seemed to shimmer with its own inner radiance. This was used to bind martyrs in the early days of the church, Marie-Claire explained. Not to cause suffering, but to help them remember that their temporary pain served an eternal purpose. The rope accepted their willing sacrifice and transformed it into something sacred. Moving to the piece of bread, she continued, this was broken and shared among the faithful during times of persecution, when gathering for proper mass would have meant death. It sustained not just their bodies but their spirits, reminding them that they were part of something larger, something that could not be destroyed by temporal powers. Finally, she lifted the wooden cup, and as she did, it seemed to fill with liquid that glowed like liquid starlight. And this has held the tears of every person who has wept in this chamber over the centuries. Not tears of despair, but tears of understanding. The moment when someone realizes that their individual suffering is part of a cosmic pattern, a divine plan that includes even pain as an instrument of love. Josephine watched in wonder as Marie Claire drank from the cup, and immediately the woman's face was transformed. The plain features that had seemed unremarkable for so many years now blazed with inner beauty, and her eyes reflected depth that spoke of communion with mysteries beyond human comprehension. "Now, do you understand, madame?" Marie Claire asked, setting the cup back on the altar. "I am not a saint in the sense of being perfect or extraordinary. I am simply a woman who chose to let her broken heart become a doorway for divine love to enter the world. And that choice, that same choice, is available to anyone who finds themselves in the darkness and decides to light a candle rather than curse the night." The Empress was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what she had heard. Finally, she spoke. "And Napoleon? Can he still make that choice?" Marie Claire's expression grew troubled. "The man your husband was, the brilliant general, the passionate lover, the dreamer who believed he could reshape Europe, that man still exists somewhere within the shell that walks the palace halls above. But he grows weaker each day as the shadow grows stronger. Soon, very soon, he will face a moment of ultimate choice. Embrace the darkness completely and lose his humanity forever, or fight against it and risk losing everything he thinks he has gained. How can we help him make the right choice? By showing him what true power looks like," Marie Claire replied, moving toward another passage that led deeper into the underground network. "The shadow offers him dominion over others through fear and compulsion. We must show him the infinitely greater power that comes from inspiring others through love and sacrifice." As they walked, the tunnel walls began to change. Instead of ancient stone, they now saw newer brickwork, and the air carried the scent of incense and beeswax candles. Somewhere ahead, voices could be heard singing, not the terrible unison chanting they had heard from the shadow touched in the streets above, but harmonious melodies that seemed to lift the soul. "Where are we going?" Josephine asked. "To meet the others," Marie Claire replied. "Did you think I was the only one who had been called to this purpose? The only one marked by grace and given understanding of what we face?" They emerged from the tunnel into a vast underground cathedral, clearly of ancient construction but lovingly maintained. The vaulted ceiling stretched high above their heads, supported by pillars carved with spirals and crosses that seemed to dance in the light of hundreds of candles. And throughout the space, people were gathered, not the nobility or high clergy Josephine might have expected, but ordinary citizens of Paris, bakers and seamstresses, blacksmiths and teachers, mothers with children in their arms, elderly men and women whose faces bore the wisdom of long experience. But as Josephine looked more closely, she began to notice that many of them bore marks similar to Marie Claire's. A young woman carried scars on her palms that glowed faintly in the candlelight. An older man's forehead bore what looked like a crown of small wounds that seemed to pulse with their own radiance. A child, a boy of perhaps 10, had marks around his wrists that shimmered like captured starlight. "Mon Dieu," Josephine whispered. "How many?" "Several thousand, scattered throughout Paris and the surrounding countryside," Marie Claire replied. "Each called in their own way, each marked by their own moment of choice between darkness and light. They are servants and shopkeepers, farmers and fishermen, the people your husband's grand strategies never accounted for, the quiet, faithful who keep the world running while emperors make their grand gestures. As they moved through the gathering, Josephine noticed that the people parted respectfully before them, but not with the obsequious bowing she was accustomed to as empress. Instead, they nodded to her with the recognition of equals, and to Marie Claire with something that looked very much like reverence. At the far end of the cathedral space, a simple altar had been erected, not ornate like those in the great churches of Paris, but humble, made of plain wood and adorned only with candles and a few sacred objects. Standing before it was a figure Josephine recognized, Brother Francois, the Franciscan monk who had given her the crucifix. But he was no longer alone. Cardinal Fesch was there, his usually political demeanor replaced by an expression of profound spiritual intensity. Captain Moreau stood nearby, his military bearing unchanged, but his eyes holding a light that spoke of recent revelation. And with them were others, priests and nuns, soldiers and civilians, all bearing the indefinable mark of those who had chosen to serve something greater than themselves. Madame l'Impératrice, Brother Francois called out, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "We have been waiting for you." As Josephine approached the altar, she noticed that the crucifix in her hands was resonating with other objects in the space. Reliquaries and blessed medals, simple wooden crosses and elaborate golden chalices, all glowing with the same warm light that emanated from Marie Claire's scars. "How long has this been here?" she asked, gesturing to the underground cathedral. "The foundation stones were laid in the 3rd century. Cardinal Fesch replied, "By Christians who understood that the faith would sometimes need to go underground to survive. But this particular gathering, we have been assembling for 3 weeks now, ever since the first reports of shadow-touched citizens began to reach us." Captain Moreau stepped forward, his scarred face serious but determined. "Madam, we need you to understand the scope of what we face. The shadow has not just infected individuals, it has begun to corrupt the very infrastructure of the city. The water supply in the eastern districts now carries a taint that spreads the infection. Food grown in contaminated soil carries the same curse. Even the air itself in some areas has become poisonous to the soul." Brother Francois nodded grimly. "But we have also discovered the shadow's limitations. It cannot spread through blessed objects or consecrated ground. It cannot touch those who bear the marks of willing sacrifice. And most importantly, it cannot compel those whose faith burns bright enough to create their own light." Marie Claire moved to the altar and placed her hands on its simple wooden surface. Immediately, the entire cathedral blazed with radiance that rivaled the sun itself, and every person present felt their own inner light respond, growing brighter in communion with the others. "The Emperor's ritual," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space, "is set for the feast of Saint Bartholomew, now just 18 days hence. If he succeeds in binding every soul in Paris to his will, the shadow will have enough collective spiritual energy to tear open permanent doorways between our world and the void that spawns such darkness." Murmurs of concern rippled through the gathering, but Marie Claire raised her hand for silence. "But," she continued, "we have the power to prevent this, not through violence or political maneuvering, but through the oldest and most powerful force in creation. Love that is willing to sacrifice everything for the good of the beloved." She looked directly at Josephine, her eyes blazing with inner fire. "Madame, you asked how we could help the Emperor make the right choice. The answer is that we must make it for him, not by forcing his hand, but by creating a tide of light so powerful that even the deepest shadow cannot stand against it." "What do you mean?" Josephine asked. though something in her heart already knew. "We mean," said a new voice from the back of the cathedral, "that we must be willing to take the darkness into ourselves, to bear the spiritual burden of every soul he has corrupted, and through our willing sacrifice, transform curse into blessing." The speaker stepped forward, and Josephine gasped in recognition. It was General Junot, but a changed Junot, his face bearing fresh scars that formed a pattern of intersecting lines across his forehead, each one glowing with its own inner light. "General," she stammered, "but you were with Napoleon. I saw you leave with the other officers." "I was," Junot replied, his voice filled with quiet strength. "But sometimes, madame, facing ultimate evil forces a man to choose what he truly serves. When I saw what my emperor had become, when I felt the shadow trying to claim my own soul through proximity to his darkness, I had to decide. Would I serve the man Napoleon was, or the thing he is becoming?" He gestured to his scarred forehead. The choice was painful. The marks appeared as I broke free from the shadow's influence, and with them came understanding of what we truly face. But also hope. Hope that if enough of us are willing to make the same choice, we might yet save, not just Paris, but Napoleon himself. Marie Claire nodded approvingly. "The General speaks truth. Each person here has made the same fundamental choice: to serve the light even unto death, to bear whatever burden is required to keep the flame of hope alive in a darkening world." She turned back to Josephine, her expression both gentle and implacable. "But you, madame, have the most difficult choice of all. You must decide whether you love Napoleon enough to risk losing him completely, whether you are willing to fight for his soul, even if it means destroying the man you married to save the man he could still become." The crucifix in Josephine's hands blazed like a star, its light joining with that of every other sacred object in the cathedral to create an illumination that seemed to reach beyond the physical realm into dimensions of pure spirit. "What must I do?" she whispered. "You must be the light that calls him home," Marie Claire replied. "And if he chooses darkness over that light, then you must be strong enough to let him go and to continue the fight without him." Around them, the gathered faithful began to sing again, not in French or Latin, but in words that seemed to bypass language entirely and speak directly to the soul. And in that music, Josephine heard something that gave her courage. The sound of hope itself, refusing to die even in the darkest of nights.